The decision to intern Japanese Americans had a lot to do with racial ideology, with racism. Long before the war, but then it was heightened during the war, in fact. And the Japanese were racialized in ways that neither the Nazis nor the Italians were. So if you notice some of the imagery here, first of all, you have white women being vulnerable to the depredations of Japanese men, Japanese military men, who are the enemy. Their facial features are almost monkey-like, which wasn't unusual to compare Asians and monkeys in much the same way they did with African Americans. You can see even this article, How to Tell Japs from the Chinese, which is kind of amazing because part of what they're trying to do is say that the Chinese are our friends, they're our allies. You've got to be able to make the racial distinctions between the two. The nose, the eyes, facial features, all playing into the same old, racial stereotypes, but also, interestingly enough, the kind of eugenics arguments that were very popular in the progressive era continue. If you look at this poster, stay in the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. This is a call to patriotism, to keep working, and to keep working at whatever wages and conditions, but you stay in the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. And again, in all these images, except for the one with the bullet chasing Hirohito, you see the Japanese as the aggressor engaged in violence. This image of the Japanese soldier carrying a white woman, much like King Kong, but more importantly, carrying a nude white woman as if to engage in rape, as if sexual assault is what's on his mind. This is a kind of hyped up imagery that can generate deep hatred for the Japanese and racial violence, but it also, again, sexualizes the whole conflict. Now, let's just move on to talk about this whole question of identity. I've been very critical of the notion that identity politics is kind of narrowly focused politics on single issues. And I want to kind of build on that. And before I start talking about gay liberation and feminism, I want to lay out in more detail a critique of what happens when you treat racial, ethnic, national, and gender-based identity movements as distinctly separate or even competing at times, because the story historically is far more complicated. Each of these movements was inspired by national and global struggles around civil rights, national liberation, and decolonization. Again, you can't even limit these movements to the United States itself. In most, with the possible exception of women's liberation, initially had significant support and solidarity from other movements. So if you look at university protests, for example, at Columbia University, it's a really good example. In 1968, protests led initially by SDS and by the Afro-American Society criticized the university's involvement in military research. It was criticizing a plan by the university to expand into neighboring Morningside Park in Harlem to build a gymnasium, basically taking away a public park for the people of Harlem. And it also began to demand ethnic studies. These were demands all in sort of one broad-based coalition of groups, and they were tied together. Likewise, at San Francisco State in 68, 69, protests began against the university submitting information about students to selective service to be able to make them draft eligible, to demanding greater admissions of working people and people of color to the university, to ultimately demanding an ethnic studies college. The demand for that produced a general strike of the university, despite the fact that African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were a minority on campus. Much of the campus struck for a College of Ethnic Studies. So in the end, it's important to recognize that these campus struggles united people across these identity groups. and critique both the university's complicity with the federal government's war policies, as well as demands for really transforming the curriculum to make it more representative of the nation.